I'm Luann Good-Gingrich. I'm the director of the Global Labor Research Center, or the GLRC, at York University in Toronto. On June 11 to 12 of this year, the GLRC and the Department of Politics at York University hosted a workshop entitled Contested Reproduction of Turkey's Financialized Capitalism, State and Society in Crisis. This was organized by Dr. Pınar Bedirhanoğlu, then visiting professor at York, and myself as director of the GLRC. I want to acknowledge with gratitude that the workshop was organized with the generous financial support of York's Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, the Vice President Research and Innovation, and the Department of Politics at York. Now, that workshop brought together critical scholars of political economy working on the case of Turkey and the recent authoritarian drive in the country. The papers presented problematized the following issues: the constructive role of financialization in authoritarian state transformation, state policies that weaken the power of labor in relation to capital, the enhancement of the coercive capacity of the state and capital for social control. Now, besides identifying the Turkey-specific determinants and consequences of authoritarianism, the June workshop situated the Turkish experience within its global context. In this fall workshop series, we will pick up that discussion, and we adopt a comparative focus to interrogate how transformative political pressures faced by the Turkish state and other countries are both the product of and the driving force behind current configurations of global capitalism. To this end, we will host Turkish scholars working on the Turkish state case or other countries with a view from Turkey to compare and contrast the social, political, and economic conditions leading to authoritarian state formations in selected country case examples. The title of this follow-up series is Contested Reproduction of States and Societies in Financialized Capitalism, Comparative Views from Turkey. Thank you to our co-sponsor for today's event, the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean, or CERLAC. And I'll turn it over now to Çağlar Dölek from Carleton University, who will introduce and chair our discussion entitled Extractivism, State and Socio-Environmental Struggles, Turkey and Ecuador Compared.
Thank you, Dan, and welcome all to our panel discussion today. I will be chairing this panel, and hopefully with your contributions, we will have a kind of lively debate on one of the most important, controversial, and contested issues that haunts our contemporary world, especially within the context of the global South. So in our panel debate today, we will have two contributions, one from Dr. Coşku Çelik. Her presentation is entitled as Extractivism in the Countryside of Turkey, Coercion, Containment, and Struggle. Coşku is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and the Department of Social Science at York University here in Canada. Coşku holds a PhD in political science from METÜ, Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Turkey. Coşku has actually worked extensively on this issue of extractive investments, patterns of polarization, and women's productive and reproductive work within the context of the countryside of Turkey. And her research interests broadly include the political economy of rural development, labor studies, and feminist political economy. And as our second presenter today, we have Dr. Duygu Avcı. Duygu is an independent researcher currently based in Istanbul, Turkey. She holds a PhD in development studies from the Institute of Social Sciences, Social Studies in the Netherlands. She has worked on diverse topics in the study of society and environment interactions, including socio-environmental struggles, environmental governance, and climate change and agriculture. Duygu's work is located at the intersection of critical development studies, political ecology, and ecological economics. Duygu has done extensive research on and teaching in Turkey, Ecuador, and Colombia, which helped her integrate a comparative perspective to her scholarly works. So before giving the voice to our presenters, I would like to invite you to contribute to our panel debate today through your questions, and our Q&A button at the bottom of your screen will enable you to do so. So please direct your questions through that button, and I would kindly invite you to provide me with the names, you know, to whom you would like to ask or raise questions or comments. At the end of our 20, our presenters will have 20 minutes, and after that we will have a kind of 5-minute individual conversation between Coşku and Duygu to deepen their discussions on the basis of some critical notes and questions. And after that we will have an open debate, hopefully with your contributions. Now I would like to invite Coşku for her presentation. Coşku, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Çağlar. Hello, everyone. Today, in this talk, I will discuss how coal rush policy of the consecutive Justice and Development Party governments, AKP governments, shaped local labor regime in Soma coal basin, and how the government organized the consent of the local population despite the destructive environmental impacts of coal investments and despite the experience of a fatal coal disaster in the basin. Because in Soma, in 2014, there was a big mine disaster and more than 300 miners died in that disaster. I will follow, while discussing the local labor regime in Soma, I follow labor regime analysis examining the workplace, local labor market, and national and global operation of state capital labor relations as internally related moments. I'll start with a brief explanation on the reason why I use labor regime analysis, and then I'll continue with coal policies of the AKP governments, and in the third part I'll discuss local control and containment strategies with reference to the findings of my field research that I carried out between 2015 to 2018 in Soma. I discuss natural resource extraction as a socio-ecological and socio-political process indicating exploitation both of both labor and nature, and this is actually inherently relational because on the one hand, resource extraction is determined by the discovery of new use and exchange values of the resources, I mean their commodification, and on the other hand, these resources determine the limits and potential of the investments and of the labor processes. And therefore, physical and structural conditions are mutually related to the class relations and class struggle within the country or the region, locality in question. And in this, it is this mutual relationship that determines the form of extractive development, extractivist development. And I discussed specificities of local labor regimes in the extractive regions. Local labor regimes are shaped by the way workers and capitalists are differently embedded in the economic landscape, and the geographical fixity or mobility of capital and labor in extractive industries, extractive regions, is determined by the state capital, labor, and nature relations. The state has to organize the relationship to implement economic policies at the local level. And actually, I relate this to the what Nikos Poulantzas calls contradictory role of the state in economic policies, because for him, the capitalist state on the one hand has the role to guarantee the stability of capital accumulation through the economic policies, whereas on the other hand, the capital state needs to organize the popular consent. And in this sense, the specialized economic apparatuses of the state became significant institutional terrains at certain localities through day-to-day or long-term state interventions. And natural resource extraction and mining is profoundly local industry, and because due to the materiality and territoriality of the extractive commodities. And the work or the labor regime is organized considering the uncertainties or obstacles related to the mechanical structure of the pits, for example, or as the investments cannot be simply relocated because of the fixity of the ore bodies, organizing the consent of the population in the localities are even more important for the extractive capital and for the state. And several institutional and community dynamics might be used to organize this consent. And in Turkey, coal production is related to the coal-fired power plants and the objective of utilizing domestic coal in electricity generation to overcome the problem of energy dependency. From the early 2000s onwards, Turkey's energy demands more than doubled, and in the first half of the 2010s, 75% of the total energy demand was imported from Iran and Russia. And this dependency on imported energy has been constituting a significant pressure on the balance of payments. And to limit the energy imports, the government, the AKP government, activated the so-called coal rush plan and declared the, for example, 2012 as the year of coal. And coal was prioritized as a strategic sector in the policy programs such as 10-10-11 development plans, or in 2017, the Ministry of Energy declared the National Energy and Mining Policy. And in this context, new coal investments have been encouraged through significant amount of subsidies, and there were measurable incentives such as direct transfers to the industry, but there were major incentives such as which are not measurable, such as investment guarantees, ease of access to credit, exemption from value-added tax, etc. And privatizations in this context have been the most significant intensive. Privatization of coal production since the mid-2000s has taken a unique form in Turkey, and it's through a royalty tender. It's through a royalty tender, and in the royalty tender, transfer of coal production are transferred to the private firms, not the ownership of the pits, ownership of the basin. And the firms in turn pay royalties to the state and provide coal to the Turkey's state-owned electricity generation company. And there is actually no, by the way, in Turkey, state is the main customer of the coal, actually sole customer of the coal. And there is no legal restriction for the firms to produce more than the minimum amount specified in the royalty tender. And the Turkish coal enterprises buys all the coal extracted by the companies. And this, as a result of this, companies tend to make profits by accelerating production, by extracting the maximum possible amount of coal at minimum costs. Also, in addition to this economic significance of coal, extractive investments in Turkey have a political significance for the AKP governments. First, coal investments in the countryside are directly related to the neoliberal transformation in another sector, which is agriculture. Rising energy investments in the countryside in the 2000s coincided impoverishment, dispossession, and therefore proletarianization of the small-scale agricultural producers as a result of the neoliberal agricultural policies. And this is significant for the state-countryside relations because the rural population in the process of dispossession welcomed these investments as an employment opportunity. There have been struggles in some cases, but mostly they were quite short-term, and they were place-based, and they have not turned into a massive struggle, countryside struggle against the extractive boom of the AKP. And employment generation capacity of these investments constituted a significant consent-making mechanism for the AKP governments. And this has been clearly reflected in the vote shares of the AKP, even in the small places where a small-scale resistance against the extractive investments took place. Even in those regions, AKP has the highest vote share in most of them, not all of them. Also, by the way, despite the privatization of coal production, AKP governments have assumed a central role in reconstructing the energy and construction sectors and transforming this performance into a base support. An aim of establishing an independent and national energy has been presented as a matter of national sovereignty. And for example, the slogan of the National Energy and Mining Policy declared in 2017 was "Independent Energy, Strong Turkey." And this discursive strength, has a discursive strength to claim that being an independent country is only possible through having independent, strong energy. And for Turkey, this can only be achieved by AKP governments under the rule of Erdogan. And in Soma Coal Basin, rhythms of investments, labor processes, or local labor control mechanisms are directly shaped by the political and economic significance of the coal industry for the government. Soma coal basin is located in Western Turkey, and coal extraction in Soma actually dates back to the early 20th century. It has a significant history of both state-operated mining and private sector-operated mining. But in Soma, royalty tender began in 2005, and the initiation of royalty tender changed the coal form of coal production significantly in the basin. Royalty tenders indicated more than a privatization, as there were small-scale private sector investments before 2005 as well. What has changed is a drastic increase of the private sector investments and conglomeration of the small firms as a result of a significant state support in the context of royalty tender. And the amount of coal extracted by the Turkish coal enterprises, state economic enterprise, declined drastically. And the increase in the share of private sector production was accompanied by orientation towards underground mining. And as underground mining has a quite labor-intensive production process, from 2005 onwards, the number of miners has increased drastically. It was around 3,000 before 2005. In 2019, it was more than, it was around 15,000. There were around 15,000 miners in Soma. And there have been two means of labor supply to the underground coal pits. One is the dispossession of the local agricultural producers, because until the 2000s, the local population in the surrounding villages of the basin were not engaged in tobacco, were engaged in tobacco farming, and they were not preferred to working in the mines, because income generated from tobacco farming was sufficient for their survival. And implementation of quota in tobacco production in late 1990s, and then the sale of the tobacco factories owned by the state to international corporations during the first half of the 2000s resulted in the impoverishment of small-scale tobacco producers, and they felt the need to search for other means of income, and this coincided the increasing underground coal investments. So male members of these families have become miners. Actually, another part of my research that I will not discuss in this talk is how agricultural production continued in Soma after these transformations, because increasing coal investments indicated diversification of means of livelihood in Soma, and this indicated further exploitation of women's productive and reproductive work in agriculture in several forms. But I'm not going to discuss it today. The second means of labor supply has been the migration of the families from other mining towns in Turkey. For the migrant workers, Soma provides a better and more secure, interestingly more secure opportunity compared to the mines in their hometowns. Because in Soma, larger firms invest, and at least now they are larger firms. Also, these firms have a purchase guarantee provided by the state, and there are no problems such as irregular payment of wages or unregistered employment. And despite such fatal disaster, the institutionalized structure of the firms makes working in Soma relatively secure, because there are illegal or unregistered firms in their coal mines in their hometowns. And there is a conflicting relationship between local and migrant workers, but this is again related to the agriculture, so I'm not going to discuss that. And for the local labor regime, labor process is, I will not go in detail of the labor process, but it's quite hierarchical. Miners are working under informal subcontracting groups, and organization of work is based on informal forms of production pressure. And these informal forms of production pressure sometimes even include physical violence. And experienced or relatively older miners explain detailedly that within the limits of formal working relations, it's not possible to extract such high amounts of coal. Also, they do not tend to try full mechanization because it is related to the technical structure of the pit, because the lignite of Soma has a high risk of burning, and pushing the technical structure through full mechanization is quite risky. So they explain the reason why they use labor-intensive methods with the fact that, for example, an experienced miner can sense the risk of coal burn, because it's quite likely to burn in the future of the coal is likely to burn in Soma. And in the local scale, various mechanisms are employed to control workers, and actually they were implemented in collaboration among the central governments, the local state institutions, coal companies, certain community organizations such as hometown organizations, and the trade union of miners. The situation of the trade union is quite interesting because all workers have to become a member of the Madeniş trade union, and the union is in close relation to the coal companies and local institutions of the government. Their collaboration can be exemplified like the nomination of candidates for union representation is decided by the coal firms and the union. Also, they may, for example, distribute already signed ballots to the miners before the union elections, or they blacklist the workers who make a complaint about the company to the trade union, or there are several ways that municipality supports the union, and so on. And so in 2014, the biggest mine disaster and workplace homicide in the history of Turkey took place in Soma, and more than 300 miners died. And following the disaster, the AKP government tended to explain it as a natural incident and suppress the criticisms and protests towards the government's responsibility. For example, Erdogan, the then prime minister, now he's president, okay, Çağlar, referred to the miners of the 19th century, or he employed the Islamic term fıtrat to underline that such tragedies are inherent and inevitable nature of mining. And a few days later, Erdogan visited Soma, and he was met by protests of the residents, and one of his advisors was kicked by a protester, and then the protester was a miner, by the way, and later he was forced to apologize publicly from Erdogan. And by the way, according to the expert reports, the disaster was a direct result of AKP government's coal policies and production pressure of the company. But with the exception of the first couple of weeks, there haven't been any massive resistance in Soma against the coal policies of the AKP. In fact, AKP has been the leading party in Soma in all the elections since that, and the consent-making potential of the extractive investments are clearly observable in Soma. Since the disaster, actually the most significant concern of the miners and their families has been employment opportunity in the coal pits. This concern is even more significant than health and safety in the coal pits or the impact of coal-fired power plants on their health. By the way, after the disaster, the pit in which disaster occurred was shut down, and almost 3,000 miners were become unemployed after that. And the significant problem defined by almost all interviewees was unemployment, and they were like waiting hopefully for the reopening up the pit in which more than 300 miners died. And through the local community and institutional networks, it's imposed upon the miners' families that it is the AKP government that finally utilized the coal of Soma, and so that they have had a job with a secular, regular income, or therefore a possible fall of AKP is imposed as a danger of the end of coal investments, closure of the existing pits, so their unemployment. For example, the General Secretary of Soma Chamber of Industry and Trade in our conversation stated that none of the former governments was willing to value coal to this extent until now. Soma was not a place visible from Ankara till the disaster, but there is no such thing as bad publicity. The disaster was such that. So they were even saying that this has been a chance that now everyone in the country, everyone in the world knows Soma because of the disaster. And I heard from the workers statements such as, coal is a blessing of God to Soma. Thanks to the coal firms, we have regular incomes now. Before that, we were just peasants. Before Erdogan, no government saw us, etc. During my visit, for example, 2 weeks before the constitutional referendum on presidency, interviewees stated that they would vote yes to the presidency because Turkey needs political stability to become an independent and strong country, and political instabilities would directly influence the future of the coal industry and therefore their employment. Also, actually, close relations of the firms in Soma with the government is a significant factor determining the role of AKP in the basin. AKP provided those firms significant incentives, and in turn they promote AKP at the local scale through various measures. I cannot go in detail of that because I think I have to conclude. And finally, there have been significant government interventions to the juridical process of the disaster, and interventions of the coal companies have there were interventions from both the companies and the government, and these have functioned as a local labor discipline mechanism. There have been, for example, the judge of the prosecution process changed after the 3 years the trial started, and AKP, this is related to the AKP's unwillingness to abandon its coal rush plan, because if there were a fair result, the government has to change the coal policies. There was a need for a significant change in that. And they forced miners not to give evidence against the company through using these local mechanisms. For example, I remember one of the miners saying that I'm unemployed for 2 years, I have 2 kids, I borrowed money even to come to the trial, and I'm sorry, but I had to drop the charge. And to conclude, the AKP government and coal firms have collaborated and instrumentally used local political, institutional, and community dynamics as labor control and discipline mechanisms. There have been small-scale resistant movements and attempts for alternative organizations, but none of them has turned into a massive movement. And I think the main reason behind the failure of these moments of resistances has been the limitation of their content to the problem of unemployment or working conditions in the mines, because the exploitation and expropriation in Soma have been multidimensional, including the dispossession of the rural population, expropriation of land, ecocide, air pollution, health and safety in the coal pits. However, none of the attempts of resistance have covered these issues. They have not targeted, for example, the neoliberal agricultural policies of the AKP, which made them convicted to the deadly working conditions in the mines. And therefore, the labor discipline and control mechanisms operated by the government and by the coal companies could easily weaken the moments of resistance and could easily organize the popular consent. Thank you.
Thank you, Coşku, for this really important presentation. Actually, Coşku has, I think, provided us with a kind of really important ground to understand both the political and, of course, political economic dynamics and strategies of extractive capital, and it is organic relation to the currently authoritarian regime in the country. I think and I hope that we will have many, on the basis of the questions coming from the audience, we will have many opportunities to deepen that discussion. But for the moment, of course, we have another important case from the global south, which is Ecuador, and I would like to invite Duygu for her presentation.
Okay, thank you to organizers for inviting me, and thank you to all participants for joining us. So in my talk, I will try to discuss how extractivism has become a key site of reconfiguration of state and society relations in Ecuador as the country shifted from a neoliberal to a post-neoliberal development model under the left government of Rafael Correa. I will focus on a particular case of a local anti-mining struggle to elaborate on how extractive development is pursued through mechanisms of consent and coercion, and how these affect collective political agency at the local level. So I will structure the talk in three parts. First, I will try to set the broader national political context of the rise of neoliberalism very briefly. Then I will talk about the trajectory of the particular local struggle before Correa came to power. And in the third part, I will focus on the strategies of the government used to advance its mining agenda and how that changed power relations at the local level. And I will conclude by emphasizing the implications of these changes for the possibilities of transformative social change in Ecuador and more broadly in Latin America. To start with the national context, like many countries in Latin America and more widely in the global south, Ecuador started to implement neoliberal policies in the 1980s in the midst of economic crises. However, from the very beginning, the implementation of the neoliberal policy agenda was met with social opposition by broad segments of the population. So during the 1980s, 90s, and the early 2000s, the country was in a state of permanent economic and political instability, marked by increasing inequality and poverty on the one hand, and popular struggles against neoliberalism, and as a result, frequently changing governments on the other. A significant development in this period was the rise of the indigenous movement. The indigenous movement in Ecuador during this period is often cited as the best organized and the most influential one in Latin America, which promoted a political agenda that combined a profound critique of capitalist neoliberal development as well as liberal nation states, with demands for more inclusionary and sustainable forms of development, differentiated citizenship, and recognition of cultural diversity, referred to as plurinationality and interculturality. So in the elections of 2006, Rafael Correa, who was a new figure in Ecuadorian politics at the time, harnessed the criticisms and demands of the social movements, and with their support came to power in 2007. With the election of Correa, Ecuador became part of the so-called left turn, or the pink tide in Latin America, so the rise of progressive governments in several countries across the region. The main pillars of Correa's political project were rolling back neoliberalism, reasserting the role of the state as the main agent of development, and implementing redistributive policies to reduce poverty and inequality. The economic policies of the government included like adopting measures to bolster state revenues and increasing social spending to deliver on its promise to reduce poverty and inequality. So extractive industries, principally oil and mining, occupied a central role in the government's economic and political agenda. Ecuador has been an oil-dependent country since the 1970s, but had not yet developed large-scale mining by the time when Correa came to power. Correa tried, on the one hand, to expand oil extraction and capture more of its revenues, and on the other, to develop large-scale mining as a new source of revenue to sustain its social spending policy. So in fact, Correa promoted what he called socially and environmentally responsible mining as indispensable to fight poverty and inequality and to achieve buen vivir, or good living, which was defined as the main goal of the state in the new constitution of 2008. So this emphasis on expanding resource extraction coupled with redistributive policies is often referred to as new or progressive extractivism, characterizing not just Ecuador, but also many of the other progressive governments in the region, in Latin America. So in this context, the relationship between extractivism and post-neoliberalism has become a hotly debated issue. And I would suggest, broadly speaking, the discussions focus on two main questions. First, what are the possibilities and limits of relying on resource extraction for long-term sustainable and inclusive development? And second, how state-led extractivism is reshaping state-society relations. I will leave the first question aside and tackle the second one by looking at the socio-environmental struggle in a region called INTAC against a large-scale open-pit copper mining project. So by the time Correa came to power, there were already several conflicts around mining in different parts of Ecuador. And INTAC, located in the northwestern Andes in the Imbabura province, was actually one of them. The conflict in INTAC dates back to mid-1990s, and there has been 3 different attempts to develop the project, initially from 1991 to 97 by a Japanese company, then from 2004 to 2007 by a Canadian company, and from 2012 to today by a partnership between the Ecuadorian state mining company, ENAMI, and the Chilean state copper company, Codelco. The anti-mining struggle, which started with the initial attempt in the 1990s, actually managed to stop the first 2 attempts and is still ongoing today. I will first briefly comment on the main aspects of the struggle from its beginning up until when the second company was ousted, and then move on to discuss how things have been changing more recently after the project was reinitiated in 2012. So from 1990s to 2007, in INTAC, quite a strong resistance was built that not only drove out 2 companies, but also catalyzed important changes in the region. The main actors of this resistance were local communities, local grassroots organizations and NGOs, and the local government, and these groups were supported by national and international environmental, anti-mining, and human rights organizations and networks. If you look at the conditions and processes that account for the strength of the movement, I think we need to consider 2 things. First, historically, the Ecuadorian state had a weak presence in the valley, not directing the socioeconomic changes at the local level, not much visible through its services, and not having firm control over the cultural life of communities. And although the neoliberal governments of the time cleared the way for expansion of mining activities, they lacked the political legitimacy and the institutional capacity to push them forward. I think this weak state presence provided the space for the civil society actors in the region to organize their struggle relatively autonomously. And having found that space is one thing, but more important was how the civil society actors filled that space with their discursive and organizational strategies. In that regard, I think the important points are these actors engaged in popular education practices and supported grassroots organizing, both aimed at building the agency and the capacity of the communities to be the agents of their own development. They linked the livelihood concerns of the communities with their own environmental concerns, particularly by developing new sustainable income generating activities framed explicitly as alternatives to mining. Moreover, during the same period in the town of Cotacachi, of which INTAC is actually a part, then the indigenous mayor pursued a project of institutionalizing participatory local governance, and the civil society actors in INTAC promoted the active engagement of the communities in the institutional spaces created within that context. I think these strategies had three crucial results. First, beyond stopping the mining activities, the resistance was transformed into a broader political project of alternative territorial development. And second, this political project was based on the notions of a dignified life, sustainable use and conservation of natural resources, and communities' right to have control over their territories and lives. So the struggle cultivated critical understandings of development, environment, and democracy. Third, the movement actors actually created spaces where these understandings were enacted in practice, so performed in everyday life of the communities. So thinking of these 3 points together, I think the mining resistance in INTAC can be seen as a process of transformative social change. Coming to the recent phase of the conflict, as I said before, the Ecuadorian state mining company, together with the Chilean company, took over the project now named Jurimagua in 2012. The project is currently still in the advanced exploration stage. The two companies made an agreement to establish a joint venture company in 2018, which is still pending. And some recent news on the project suggests that the Ecuadorian state is actually looking to auction its share because it does not have the resources needed to invest in the project. I should also add that in addition to this particular project, BHP Billiton, the largest mining company in the world, acquired 5 new concessions in the western end of the valley. And there is another project being developed at about 60 kilometers to the northeast of the region. So it is likely that the mining expansion in this northern part of Ecuador will not be limited to this particular project, Jurimagua, but will be more widespread. So how in the context of state-led extractivism, the dynamics of the struggle have changed in this last period? I think the key difference here is certainly the role of the state. And one way to understand the role of the state is to think about state discourses and practices as mechanisms of consent and coercion aimed at establishing a developmental hegemony. So what these mechanisms entailed, with respect to mechanisms of consent, I think the most important one is developmental discourses. These discourses portray mining as indispensable to achieve development or good living, almost equated to it. And this concept of good living was actually used by social movements to displace the dominant understanding of development. However, in the hands of the government, it became a way of legitimizing extraction. So the government simply associates good living with the usual marks of modern development: roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, and modern houses, kind of depriving it of its initial radical content developed by particularly the indigenous movement. And the government especially refers to responsible mining suggesting that mining will be done in a quote-unquote good way by distributing its benefits more equally and by using modern science and technology to manage its environmental impacts. In addition to contributing to national development, mining is also represented as the only means to local development in these areas, that it will bring progress to quote-unquote backward places and communities, create employment, provide resources to improve infrastructure and services. Equally important, I think, is that these discourses are materialized, at least to a certain extent, through specific interventions in mining territories. For instance, in some places, the government used advanced royalty payments to build what are called millennium schools, or bridges or roads. And in the case of INTAC, some ministries established local offices and started to implement social programs such as support for coffee production or support for nurseries. And also a new police station was built, allegedly to improve security in the valley. And another way that the state presence was established in INTAC was through the so-called socialization meetings, or by employing community promoters going from door to door to share information about the projects, laws and regulations governing the sector, and convince people about the benefits of mining. So it is through these material practices that permeates the everyday life of people that the state as a developmental agent is instantiated, is produced and reproduced in these territories. So with respect to the mechanisms of coercion, we can consider the use of discursive and legal means as well as direct force. So the use of discursive means concerns most notably the efforts of the government to delegitimize mining opponents. For instance, the president publicly called them infantile environmentalists, traitors, or even terrorists. And in several of his weekly public speeches, Correa actually specifically targeted one of the main leaders of the opposition in INTAC. The use of legal power involved, on the one hand, enacting regulations to increase state control over grassroots and civil society organizations, for instance, by obliging them to align their objectives with those of the national plans, or to register their activities and funding sources with the relevant state institutions. The government also tried to, and in some cases actually did, shut down some organizations, particularly the environmental organizations opposing extractivist development. So during my fieldwork in INTAC, the members of some of the civil society organizations indeed expressed their fear that they could face similar threats. The government also used its legal power to criminalize and persecute anti-mining leaders. In INTAC, a peasant who was also the president of the community closest to the mining site and a firm opponent of mining was detained on charges of rebellion and was sentenced to prison for 10 months. And finally, the government sent security forces to mining sites to establish control and quash protests. In INTAC, for instance, in May 2014, around 300 to 400 police were sent to the valley to accompany the mining company workers with the pretext that the mining opponents were preventing their work and threatening their security. Considering the influence of these mechanisms of consent and coercion, I would like to highlight the following points. First, developmental discourses and practices foment new expectations, new desires, and new subjectivities. So previously, the struggle in INTAC had managed to build a conception of development as a kind of a humble local process to create conditions to live in dignity, a process directed and realized by local communities themselves, positioning communities as the agents of their own development. The state discourses and practices, however, refashions development as something delivered by the state and the communities as its recipients. Rather than committing to a slow and arduous process of autonomous local development, they kind of entice people to become part of a more ambitious national endeavor. And it seems that the government kind of succeeded in winning over at least some people. And that also resulted in the deepening of the divisions within the communities that actually existed before between those who support and oppose mining. And second, the increasing state presence in the region has undermined the social, economic, and political spaces that the civil society actors and local communities had constructed together. These spaces were key to cultivating critical subjectivities in INTAC, and as they have been undermined, the state has become the protagonist in reshaping the territorial dynamics in the region and the everyday life of communities. So while previously civil society actors were the ones setting the agenda in the valley, now they have to grapple with the question of how to respond to the government's promises, how to engage with the government without compromising their position, or how to oppose it without losing their legitimacy or popular support. And third, the coercive measures seemed to instill fear and resignation in the local communities and civil society actors, at least in some of them, fueling the sentiment that given the government's determination to pursue the mining project and its readiness to use force, there is no way to resist anymore. So to sum up, extractivist development has become a key site of state building and construction of developmental hegemony in Ecuador, as the state is routinely produced and reproduced in territories of resource extraction, and development becomes the main frame through which the lives and subjectivities of local communities are construed. And at the same time, the autonomy and agency of civil society is being eroded, and alternative understandings and subjectivities are being subdued. Arguably, this changing balance of forces is one of the most troubling aspects of state-led extractivism. The social movements in different parts of Ecuador and Latin America, including many local socio-environmental struggles, are often considered as spaces where radical alternatives to development, capitalism, and even modernity are being imagined and experimented with. So state-led extractivism, from that perspective, needs to be questioned because it weakens the radical potential of these struggles and consequently the possibilities for transformative social change at a broader scale. So I will leave it here and thank you.
Thank you very much, Duygu, for your interesting and important insights into another important case in Latin America. So I think we have this different dimensions of the issue within the context of two important countries from the global south. Before going to the question and answer session, actually, I would like to invite our speakers to critically reflect upon each other's presentations based on their critical notes and possibly questions. So after that, we will have a question and answer session. And once again, I would like to remind our audience that, please just use our Q&A button and please, provide me with the name of the person that you would like to ask question and provide a kind of summary, and I will be sharing your question to our presenters. So for the moment, I would like to invite Coşku firstly maybe to provide a kind of 5-minute critical reflection on Duygu's presentation, and we will have Duygu after that, so that I think it will provide us with a relational discussion and the opportunity to deepen that discussion. So Coşku, the floor is yours again.
Thank you, Çağlar. And let me start with how should I have started my presentation by thanking the people who organized this webinar, and thank you Pınar and Luan for inviting me as well. Actually, and thank you, Duygu. I really learned so much about the experience in INTAC while listening to you and while actually reading your other papers. And I thought while listening you that regarding the attempts to organize the consent, looks like the most significant similarity between our cases, between Turkey and Ecuador, is the similarity in the discourse of energy and mining, because energy dependency or having a strong energy as a matter of national sovereignty is underlined by both governments, and or mining as an instrument of bringing modernization and development to the countryside. And I think another similarity is that despite there are significant moments of consent, both governments at least attempted to apply repressive measures as well. To a certain extent, they could be successful, like in Turkey. In certain cases, they could not. But the way people are articulated or resisted to neoliberalism in general and local energy investments in particular are profoundly different. And I thought this has several reasons. And while listening you, I thought that relation to the state is quite different in these cases. For example, you mentioned the absence of the state in INTAG, and that mine investments indicate the presence of the state and its control. But for Soma, it's completely different, because what they felt after the neoliberal transformation of agriculture is the lack of state support. That's why they felt insecurity of continuing agricultural production. And then they became miners in the private companies, but still the state has a central role in those investments, and the state has a central role in the social relations in the basin as well. Mostly when I ask them what should change in Soma, their answer is that the mines should be operated by the state. And they would prefer the state support in several means. And despite the privatizations, they still have a close connection with the neoliberal authoritarian state. And they do not always feel the existence of the state as only as a moment of coercion, at least. Because despite the fact that a state official went there and they kicked the miners, they still explain the existence of state as a means of security or means of certainty in their lives. And similarly, for example, when their lands in their villages were expropriated by the state for construction of new pits since the 2000s, they are mostly okay with that. They just need the money, and actually they also interpret as a state support as well, the state, because they cannot earn too much, at least sufficient from their agricultural production. So expropriation of their lands by the state is mostly positively explained by the local villagers. And also another difference, as I saw, and also we discussed this with Duygu before, market dependency in social reproduction is quite different in these two cases. Not market and cash dependency, maybe. The means of livelihood in Soma was not a subsistence production even before the neoliberal transformation of agriculture and or coal mining. Before that, they were commodity producers. What they were selling their products to the state, and the state was providing a purchase guarantee, but their lives were still, they were still petty commodity producers. They were not peasants in the traditional terms. They were not, their livelihood was not based on subsistence production. Okay, their market dependency increased, their cash dependency increased, but still it is not like the initiation of capitalism there, but instead deepening of commodification of everyday life, commodification of production or of subsistence. What I thought while listening to you is that people are in TAC are more independent from the market mechanism, or mechanisms of non-market means of subsistence is much more stronger, as far as I understand from your presentation. And I thought that this difference is an important factor in different means of organizing the consent. And for example, in one part of your presentation, you said that they had some expectations of becoming wage workers, having better infrastructure, more consumption opportunities. These were actually happened in Soma. Maybe that's not why consent is successfully organized by the government, because, okay, they have become wage workers, they use credit cards, they have mortgage debts. So losing the wage employment is a significant factor preventing the miners to be involved in small-scale protests. They are debted, they are really market dependent, their lives significantly changed. And because even families who still continue agricultural production, by the way, most of the families are still continuing in several means, mostly through the use of women's labor. They use the income they receive from the mining to finance the cost of agricultural production, because their agricultural production is also quite market dependent. And overall, I think the main reason why there has been a strong resistance against neoliberalism and extractive developmentalism in Ecuador is, and this has not been the case in Turkey, is related to the successful mechanisms of inclusion in Turkey. This is also related to the power of neoliberalism as a hegemonic project in more general terms. And that's, I should stop here, I think.
Thank you, Coşku, for your timely response. And the floor is yours, Duygu.
Okay, thank you, Coşku, for your comments. And as you suggested, I agree that the discourses on energy or mining bringing development is key in organizing consent in both contexts. But I also think that in addition to this, we should also think about whether there are discourses that can kind of disorganize or disrupt this mechanism of consent. And I believe a key difference between Turkey and Ecuador is that in Ecuador, the social movements and civil society and political actors, both at the national and local levels, have provided these kind of alternative discourses that, on the one hand, questions what development means, who defines it, whether there can be social or ecological limits to it. And on the other hand, also offered new ways of imagining and talking about a better society, a better future. However, in Turkey, even the progressive social movements actually endorse that kind of developmental discourse. In Turkey, social and political struggles have been more about, in the words of political ecologist, our colleague Murat Arsel, these struggles have been more about development alternatives rather than alternatives to development. And I think this is linked to a broader issue concerning the historical trajectory of progressive social movements and political struggles in the two countries. So what I would like to emphasize in that respect is that, so the movements and struggles in Ecuador have never faced a state apparatus as willing and capable of using repression as the Turkish state. I'm not suggesting at all that there has not been no state repression in Ecuador, but I think compared to Turkey, it has been much less pervasive. And for instance, in the case of implementation of neoliberal policies, Ecuador, actually in contrast to many other Latin American countries as well, in Ecuador, neoliberal policies started to be implemented under the mandate of civilian governments, but in Turkey they came with a bloody military coup. And in this context, I think the Ecuadorian social movements and political struggles have had more autonomy in formulating their political agendas and pursuing their organizational strategies. But beyond that, another issue is beyond the power of the state. I think the Ecuadorian movements have been much more successful at organizing at the grassroots level and establishing more democratic organizational structures. In INTAC, for instance, the organizations did not just work for the communities, but worked with them. Actually, promoting the active agency of local communities is one of the main aspects of that struggle. While, as you were mentioning, Coşku, in the case of, for instance, the mining union in Soma, the organization is much more hierarchical. I mean, these are two examples, but I think we can multiply those examples and think about, you know, what are the, how the movements and civil society actors organize themselves. I mean, how democratic they are or not. And one final point that I want to make, and related to also, you know, your comments on, you know, the inclusion, financial inclusion of people in Soma, the becoming wage workers and increasing consumption opportunities, that you mentioned at some point that you heard statements in Soma like, before we were just peasants, suggesting like being a peasant has negative consequences in Soma. In Intact, I actually heard exactly the opposite statements, people being very proud of their peasant identity, those who oppose mining, being very proud of their peasant identity, saying things like, we are peasants and we want to continue live as peasants, or we don't want to go to the cities and live in misery there. I think this illustrates very well the importance of cultural dimension of both hegemony and struggles against it. So to resist state and capital, as you emphasized in relation to, you know, building consent, dependency on or autonomy from the market for social reproduction is crucial to the ability of communities to subaltern classes to resist. But I think values, meanings, and identities are equally important. And I would suggest, like, this is a point that social movements in Turkey might actually learn from Ecuador and maybe other Latin American social movements. So yeah, I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Coşku and Duygu, for this critical and engaging discussion. Actually, I feel that I have learned a lot in the context of two different important case studies, and of course, we can be sure about the fact that, you know, this theme, this very fundamental issue, has become already quite crucial and will be gaining its importance in the decades to come. So I have received some questions from our audience, and I would like to share those questions because I think we will have about 20 minutes for critical reflection or answers and comments coming from you on the basis of those questions. And then, you know, we can have a final word from your side. So my plan is to share these questions with you. I will be reading those questions so that the entire audience can hear the questions. And I would like to invite you for about, let's say, 8 minutes of individual reflection on the basis of the questions coming from the audience. So our first question is for Coşku, by Ali Alper Alemdar. Ali Alper asks about how does Coşku explain AKP's significant amount of subsidies to the local industry, even though coal production and extractive economy remains insignificant as a share of GDP. This is the first question for Coşku, and we have two questions for Duygu, and actually I will have a kind of common question for both of you at the end, so I will share my own question as well. So Duygu, it is for you by Alexander Mursa. It is a kind of a long paragraph, so I will be reading while trying to be clear. So taking into consideration that so-called responsible mining is ineffective and can be compared to greenwashing, yet another ethical label that doesn't actually affect change, what can be done outside of protests that can actually be effective in shifting to other forms of development and, most importantly, renewable energy? Are there any examples of success in terms of policies, programs, other models of investment in the global south? This is for you, Duygu. And another question for Duygu is from Pınar Bedirhanoğlu. Could Korea become really post-neoliberal in extractivism, despite their discourse? So these were the questions. I think I have, no, okay. I have received another message. So these were the questions coming from the audience, and I would like to have another maybe question coupled with a comment. And I really would like to hear about your ideas on it, because, you know, we are holding this panel virtually, but this panel is hosted by York University, which is located in Canada. So the Canadian context, the Canadian capital in extractivism, as you know, is really crucial. As far as I know, 70% of the extractive capital, extractive companies are currently located in Canada, especially in the mining sector. So Latin America has always been a kind of base for extractivism for the Canadian capital for decades. And we see the increasing involvement of Canadian capital in Turkey as well. So I really want to, want to hear about your ideas about the relationship between transnational or international capital and the making of new developmentalism or new extractivism in the global south. And as an additional question for that, maybe how can we relate the role of the international to the making of neoliberal authoritarian or post-neoliberal authoritarian regimes in Turkey, in Latin American countries, and in global south in general? So this is my general comment coupled with a question. I think we can begin with Coşku for answer.
Thank you. And thank you for the questions. I'll start with Ali Alper's question. And thank you for this question, by the way, because this also indicates a significant difference between Latin American experience and Turkey's extractivism, because in Turkey, it does not constitute it is not like a constitutive factor in the country's development, because it's by this way, for example, quite different from not only Ecuador, but also from Latin American experiences. Coal rush of Turkey is directly related to the recent problem of energy dependency, and it's actually a kind of a import substitution, because import substitution through domestic extraction, because the problem is related to the high dependency of imported energy. And I think also the political factors I underlined are quite significant in this sense, because at the discursive level, AKP uses this in both in energy and construction investments, like having the biggest investment, making the biggest airport, etc. They are all related to each other, I think. Also, but in economic terms, in the 11th development plan, which covers the period between 2018 to 2022, it can be seen that the use of domestic coal in electricity generation has risen around 4% between 2014 to 2018. Also, most significant part of those incentives provided to the coal industry are for lignite exploration, and they are trying to enlarge their reserves. And again, within this period, coal reserve, lignite coal reserve has increased for around 5 billion tons. And for the other question regarding the renewables and the alternatives, I want to answer this with reference to the ongoing discussions in Turkey, because renewable energy is barely discussed in Turkey, not only by the government, I mean the oppositional movements, oppositional parties, etc. as well. For example, last month, the President Erdogan declared that certain amount of natural gas reserve was explored in northern Turkey, and I scanned almost all newspapers or other platforms, and the criticisms of oppositional scholars, parties, organizations, etc., was on whether this amount, the amount explored, is sufficient to overcome energy dependency or not. The renewable energy, the problems with the fossil energy or climate change, ecology was not even a concern. In Turkey, what Duygu underlines regarding the social movements or organizations within social movements was right, but that's right for the labor organizations, for example. The ecological struggle in Turkey is not that widespread, and it's barely becomes in the agenda of the oppositional groups in the country as well. And I'll leave it here for now.
Okay, Duygu.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I will start with Alexandra's question. So I think first, I mean, as much as the discourse on responsible mining is not bringing effective change, I think we can still take this seriously. I mean, because in Ecuador, mining has become such a contentious issue, I think there is no real discussion about what can be done to do it in a more responsible way indeed. I mean, some of the, for instance, suggestions in that regard is actually making the companies comply with environmental regulations. So even though, there are new laws and regulations for managing environmental impacts, there are reports, even from the state institutions themselves, suggesting that, the environmental ministry is not enforcing those regulations. And there might be, more participation with the communities to define where to do mining, how to do it, and such, and also to involve the communities in the monitoring. And there have been suggestions around that. And beyond that, I mean, if we are going to think about what other forms of development are available, first I think we need to ask, what are we trying to achieve? How do we define development in the end? So, for instance, a lot of people now talk about food sovereignty as a defining aspect of what we want to, of a better future, or defining like meeting essential needs, but living a relatively humble life. I mean, a modest life, not trying to recreate a consumerist middle class society as development. So I think this first has to be defined. Another type of suggestion, practical policy suggestion, is that one of the reasons why resource extraction has increased so much in the 21st century, or from the 19th onwards, was increasing demand for raw materials, including copper, gold, and others. So, and the idea is that the cost of these materials in international markets do not reflect their environmental costs. I mean, there are, of course, problems with putting a monetary value to any environmental cost, but at least it is a step to try to, include the prices of the cost of environmental impacts in their prices. And that would, on the one hand, increase the revenues of those countries who export those resources, and also hopefully will decrease the demand for these resources. And that's another practical policy suggestions. But this cannot be done by a single country, because if, say, Ecuador puts such a price, increases the price of the copper that it produces, so anyone from China buying the copper will go to the next country, will go to Chile, to Peru to buy the copper from there. So it has to be a regional or international policy. And you also asked, you mentioned what are the forms of development and especially renewable energy. And I think that was one interesting development in INTAC, actually, where I did my work, was that the communities and some of the civil society organizations collaborated with energy union workers from France to develop a project for small-scale hydropower plants within the region, and then to use the revenues from to meet the energy requirements, demands of the local communities, but also use the revenues from those mining projects and from these renewable energy projects to improve, to invest in other areas in the valley. And another thing is, again, an example from Ecuador was the Yasuni initiative. If there is the question of, if we don't do mining, where are the resources to, invest in, to improve the welfare of the Ecuadorian citizens are going to come from? One very important initiative was the Yasuni initiative to leave oil underground. So the idea was that there is this Yasuni National Park in the Amazon region of Ecuador, and in some parts of the park there are oil exploitations going on, but there was one sector that it was suggested first initially by the social movements, and then the idea was taken up by the Ecuadorian government. Like, we know how much there's an estimate of how much oil is there in that part of the national park, and it was, I think, estimated around $7 billion, the value of oil in that part. And the government said, okay, we are going to promise not to extract that oil, but we are asking the international community to, compensate Ecuador with half of the foregone revenues. So the idea was going, it was going to be kind of an international solidarity to actually, allow Ecuador to meet its developmental needs without going into extraction. And the whole idea of, Amazon being the lungs of the planet and stuff. So if it is the lungs of the planet, so you put your money under your word. But then the thing failed. So I think there are concrete initiatives, there are concrete policy suggestions coming from social movements, coming from scholars and such. But the problem is, the developmental hegemony is, being reproduced again and again. So I took long. And sorry, the second question was, did Korea become really post-neoliberal? That's like, a hotly debated issue. To what extent post-neoliberalism was different from neoliberalism? I think it is important that, if we look at the progressive governments in Latin America, starting with Chavez at the end of the 1990s, like, that was a time when neoliberalism reigned supreme globally, almost, So it is important that these are the governments that said, challenged there is no alternative discourse, and actually came up with, policies and programs to reverse the worst impacts of neoliberalism. And it is true, like, the state increased the, increased the control of the state over the market, over oil, over the oil sector, and captured more of the rents. For instance, changed the tax system, and then it did redistribute a substantial amount of resources for social spending. And I think, during the neoliberal period, it was, the idea was poverty alleviation was the policy discourse. And I think these governments, including the Korea government, managed to put, not just poverty alleviation, but also inequality across the axis of class and ethnicity at the center of political agenda. And but on the other hand, you can also say, because they continued with resource extraction, because the whole post-neoliberal model that they pursued dependent on revenues from resource extraction. So they couldn't break the dependency of these countries on global markets. And because, for instance, like their main exports is oil, and now the oil prices are going down, so they are in economic crisis again. And the idea at the beginning of the whole project was we are going to use resources, revenues from resource extraction to diversify the economy. And they did fail in that. So in a way, I think there are some successes in, you know, moving away from neoliberalism, but in other aspects, they couldn't achieve as much. And that's like the structural transformation of the economy didn't happen. What else? Do I have time more? Your question about Canadian companies, Çağlar. So I think this is also, you know, in Latin America, especially, the Canadian companies are everywhere, basically. And there has been a lot of resistance to that. And one issue was there were campaigns to actually sort of create regulations in Canada to hold these companies listed in the Canadian Stock Exchange for what they do in other countries, hold them accountable for what they do in other countries, but this wasn't accepted. And actually, if you look at the companies that do the explorations, there are what are called junior companies. For instance, in Turkey, those ones doing the explorations are those kind of junior companies. And then these companies usually, if there is like a promising feasibility study, economic feasibility study, they sell these projects to larger companies. And how these smaller companies make money is not basically actually by producing anything, but actually through the, you know, valorization of their company stocks in the Canadian Stock Exchange. So it is, you know, the financialization of the whole thing has allowed that. So I will stop.
Okay, thanks a lot, Duygu and Coşku, for this really lively debate. And you have provided us with different perspectives and insights about what is really going on in terms of the making of extractive industries and its relation to capital, labor, and other fundamental processes so far present, actually. So I once again would like to thank to our both presenters, and of course to our audience for their presence here and for their questions. And as a last note, maybe I would like to, if you are interested in our series, and if you want to hear more about this series as well as other activities of the Global Labor Research Center at York University, you are more than welcome to send emails to glrc@yorku.ca to be informed about other activities, as well as 2 additional virtual workshops that will be held in late October and in late November. So these were the last words that I would like to share with you. Thanks everyone for being here and for contributing in any kind to this important debate. Have a healthy and nice day.